It is my pleasure to introduce to you Ms. Layli Fadahi. She is a research fellow at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs and adjunct associate professor at the University of Minnesota Law School. Her teaching and research focus on the legal, ethical, societal, and policy dimensions of emerging technologies such as nanotechnology, biotechnology, genetics, and robotics in convergent areas of emerging technologies, such as synthetic biology and human enhancement technologies. That's a lot of stuff. Layli received her JD from the University of Minnesota in 2010 and her Bachelor's of Science from Cornell University in 2005. She also studied at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Prior to joining the Humphrey School, she was Associate Director of Research and Education at the University of Minnesota's Consortium on Law and Values in Health, Environment, and the Life Sciences. She has received several awards, has numerous publications, and has served as the faculty editor-in-chief of the Minnesota Journal of Law, Science, and Technology. She is the recipient of numerous prestigious grants from such sources as the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation. Most recently, she is director of the Initiative on Governance of Emerging Technological Systems. This is a new university-wide initiative. Boy, my articulation is not very good today, I'm sorry. Supported by the Humphrey School that brings together a multidisciplinary group of faculty members from across university departments and centers with external partners from industry, government, and the public to advance research, facilitate dialogue, and catalyze solutions pertaining to the governance of a range of emerging technologies and technological systems. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Layli Fadahi.
Thanks, everyone. So today I want to focus on the need for ethical innovation, where we see the convergence of engineering and the life sciences. I have two quick caveats. And the first is, while the convergence of engineering and the life sciences is occurring across a range of different sectors, today I'm really only going to be focusing on, or primarily concentrating on, areas of convergence within the biomedical field. But this doesn't mean that there aren't also important ethical issues raised by this convergence in areas such as agriculture and animal engineering and some of these other areas. And then my second caveat is that given the time restraint that we have today, I'm really only going to be highlighting a few examples of this convergence, but you should keep in mind that there are many other examples across the biomedical field that I may not necessarily be spending a lot of time on. So I want to start today with three suppositions about the convergence of engineering and the life sciences. The first is that new tools and techniques that are enabling greater control and manipulation of different biological parts and components and systems that make up living things are also changing the way in which we regard the value, the utility, ownership, and the sanctity of these biological components and systems. My second supposition is that these new tools and techniques, as well as the accompanying changes they bring, have profound implications both for who is involved in and how we conduct research and provide patient care, as well as how we regard the human body more generally. And then finally, my third supposition is that these resulting changes present new ethical dilemmas, that reach far beyond the current boundaries of research ethics, medical ethics, and engineering ethics as we conceive of them today. So let's begin with this first notion that advancements in engineering at the convergence with the life sciences come about, that they are changing the way in which we regard the value of these different biological parts. So, the convergence of engineering and the life sciences, particularly in this area of human health applications, is not really bounded strictly in time, meaning it's not necessarily something entirely new. At its very core, I think this convergence of engineering and the life sciences comes about through the understanding of organisms as just being a series of parts, structures, and processes that make up more complex biological systems. So if one of these parts breaks or has some kind of defect, we might look to engineering to provide a solution in order to fix that problem. So for example, if the natural pacemaker cells of the heart stop working correctly for some reason, we might implant an artificial pacemaker to fix that problem. So thus we have an engineered solution to something that's a biological problem. Now you might say that this is not necessarily, the convergence of engineering and the life sciences. You might say this is just an engineering solution. But I would push you to consider that this engineered solution doesn't consist of just this man-made device. The pacemaker by itself doesn't do anything. It's only in combination with the architecture of the heart and through the sorts of other activities and functions of the heart that we have a functioning system. So the whole thing is one engineered system, and only part of it is man-made. So, in some ways, I think we can think of this as an example of a convergence, but perhaps we can say that this is an example of a weaker convergence. So while the man-made and the naturally existing parts have to interact in order to form a functional system, the heart's pre-existing architecture is a limiting factor in the design of the engineered device. And furthermore, there really isn't any attempt here to re-engineer the design of the heart, to redesign the heart such that it does something that a heart otherwise wouldn't do. But more recently, I think engineering and the life sciences have become more strongly convergent as a result of some tools that have become available that give us the ability to see and understand and control and manipulate matter at the molecular and submolecular scales. So this, for example, is an atomic force microscope that allows us to see things at the smaller level as well as to manipulate the placement of atoms within a structure. So when applied to a biological system, this ability to see and manipulate at this smaller molecular and submolecular scale is really giving rise to the ability to see and understand and manipulate the different neural, genetic and genomic, protein, cellular, metabolic, viral, whatever other pathways that comprise bodily function and contribute to disease susceptibility and onset. So for example, advances in genetic engineering are allowing scientists to directly manipulate an organism's genome by inserting new DNA into a host genome, knocking out or knocking in genes, adding, deleting, or introducing different point mutations in the gene using different kinds of gene targeting techniques. So I think we can regard this perhaps as a stronger example of a convergence. Again, we have an engineered solution to something that's a biological problem, and all the parts of the system have to interact in order to carry out the intended function. However, in this instance, we have a little more design freedom. We may be doing some limited redesigning of function, for example, in terms of protein expression. But we're really only able to do so, again, within the confines of what the architecture of the DNA allows. And furthermore, we're not really changing the basic design aspects of the DNA such that the DNA is now doing something other than what DNA would otherwise do in the human body. Now, more recently, we see a push in this convergence of engineering and the life sciences that seeks to give us complete design freedom. That is the ability to completely engineer the structure and production of biological components and systems and even organisms with structures and functions that don't otherwise exist in nature. So fields like synthetic biology are seeking to use really what are engineering-based principles to reduce biological components down to a set of standardized basic parts, which can then be combined and built into larger systems with these computing-like behaviors. And in addition to being able to build these more sophisticated systems, those systems and the resulting behaviors, the idea is that then those can be tested against model predictions of system dynamics. So these principles are the basis for the development of things like what are referred to as biobricks. And biobricks are these standardized biological parts that I was mentioning. So namely, when we're talking about biobricks currently, we're talking about these DNA sequences that have well-defined structures and well-defined functions, and that are designed to be combined and incorporated into a living cell, like E. coli, for example, to construct some sort of new biological system. So each of these biobricks is part of a DNA sequence that's held within a circular plasmid. And then each of these different parts, each biobrick, encodes some basic biological function. So it could be something like encoding for a particular protein, or inhibiting transcription somewhere in downstream sequence. So by chaining together these biobricks, one can create devices of biobricks that impart some kind of human-defined function. So for example, producing a fluorescent protein when it comes into contact with a particular environmental chemical. And then furthermore, those then biobrick systems can be combined into even larger systems of biobricks that are capable of performing more sophisticated, higher level functions. So for example, displaying a range of colors at certain pre-specified light frequencies. And these biobricks are the ones that are used in the International Genetic Engineering Machine Competitions, the iGEM competitions that some of you might be familiar with, that have become quite popular amongst undergraduate and now even some high school students. So in recent years, we've seen iGEM teams that have used these biobricks to develop, one that was developed, for example, was an E. coli detector for arsenic that would respond to changes in environmental pH. Or another project that I saw that was quite interesting was they engineered a human cell line that would inhibit key proteins that are responsible for the immune cell responses that can cause sepsis. And there are other projects that are underway to engineer bacteria that can regulate gene expression, for example, in response to a particular wavelength of light. There's a project underway to develop bacteria that are able to conditionally invade cancer cells. For example, when they come into an environment where there is particularly low levels of oxygen, as one would find inside a tumor. Or it could do that in response to a particular chemical that you put into that environment. And so beyond what these applications are, researchers are now looking to different synthetic biology methods to first help with identifying different disease mechanisms and drug targets, but then also for creating new tools for drug discovery and to develop new therapies and new therapeutic delivery systems and platforms. So I think this kind of work demonstrates a much even stronger level of convergence in engineering and life sciences. So we're given fairly unfettered freedom within the design space, both with respect to the architecture of the engineered system and with respect to what we want the outcome of that design system to be in terms of function, what we want the functional design of the system to be. Now, I said earlier that this convergence is changing the ways in which we regard the value and the utility and the ownership and the sanctity of different biological parts and components. And it seems to me that as we're able to reduce biological systems down to their working parts, and even more so as we're able to then standardize those parts such that they're no longer unique to the individual, the utility of those parts and the ownership interest in those parts becomes far less valuable to the individual, while at the same time those smaller, more standardized parts become much more valuable from the perspective of the research community and sort of society at large. And I think that this is empirically demonstrable. So for example, we're both legally and ethically very concerned about the rights and the welfare of the individual with respect to how their bodies are treated both in research and in the course of medical care. We really regard the individual as having these unalienable, having some level of unalienable autonomy over their body as a whole, and as well we believe that they have a right to informed consent prior to any intervention with their body, be it clinical or be it research. We believe that we're kind of the masters of our own bodies. We are the owners of our own bodies. And we extend these legal and ethical rights to biospecimen as well, though not to as great an extent. We recognize that a biospecimen contains a massive amount of personal and potentially clinically valuable health data. And we've seen numerous court decisions at the same time that have not been quite as quick to say that the individual has unequivocal ownership rights over their biospecimen once those biospecimen have been removed from the body. And really the underpinning of these legal decisions is really premised on this belief that biospecimens have little to no value to the individual once they've been removed from the body, while at the same time they can have quite a significant value for researchers in terms of research outcomes. This is even more true once we get to this level of genetic data. Our laws are increasingly taking the position that an individual's only legal and ethical rights with respect to genetic and genomic data are those that pertain to privacy. So as long as a researcher takes the necessary steps to de-identify such data in a way that it can't be linked to the identity of the individual that it came from, the idea now is that there's really no remaining ownership interest in that genetic data, nor is there even a need necessarily to provide informed consent for the use of that data in research. At the level of the isolated gene, we see great freedom on the part of researchers. We've seen in recent years many patents that have arisen specifically around isolated genes, and while we had a recent Supreme Court decision that held that isolated human genes are not patentable subject matter, this decision was made on the basis that isolated genes are products of nature. It was not made on the basis that the source from which the isolated gene came from had any rights to those genes. And furthermore, innovations in technology that use isolated genes are still patentable, and there's no legal requirement right now that the profits from such innovations be shared with the source that the genes came from. So we can imagine that this trend will be even stronger once we get to the level of these standardized biological parts, which have virtually no individually identifying information and really no valuable characteristics for individuals. And I think it's worth noting that our decisions as to the declining value of these biological parts for the individual have largely been based on bioethical and medical ethics considerations. In reaching these decisions, the courts and the different regulatory bodies that have grappled with this issue have taken into consideration things like the individual's right to autonomy, justice, privacy, protection from unjustified physical or psychological or social risk, with the assumption being that these sets of ethical considerations are sufficient to protect the rights and welfare of individuals. But what I want to purport is that we need to start thinking about whether this really is the case, that these biomedical and medical ethic considerations are the sufficient set of considerations that we need to look at. So with that, I want to turn to my second and third suppositions that the convergence of engineering and the life sciences is changing who is involved in and how we conduct research and provide patient care in regard to the human body more generally, and that this convergence is also challenging the scope and boundaries of research ethics, medical ethics, and engineering ethics. And I'm going to address these 2 points jointly because I think they're largely interdependent and better handled that way. So I want to start by highlighting what some of the similarities and differences are that exist in the clinical care and biomedical research context with respect to the legal and ethical obligations that are due to the patient or the human subject, depending on which scenario we're in. So by and large, a lot of the duties are kind of the same regardless of which context we're looking at. So there's shared duties for beneficence and non-malfeasance, respect for the patient or subject's autonomy, respect for justice, dignity, protecting the confidentiality and privacy of the patient or subject, and a duty to obtain informed consent. But there are, a couple of differences or important exceptions. The main exception being that a physician has a duty to provide medical care that the researcher does not. And this physician's duty really extends to all different stages of medical care, all the way from prevention to diagnosis to treatment to ongoing monitoring. And so the biomedical researcher, on the other hand, has no such duty to provide medical care. They really only have this duty to minimize the risk to the human subject and to ensure that there's some sort of balance between the risks to the human subject and the benefits, if any, to the subject or to society at large. And in fact, one of the major considerations in biomedical research when obtaining informed consent is to make sure that the human subject doesn't have the misconception that they're entering a therapeutic relationship or receiving therapy in the context of that research. So, while biomedical research might influence the development of a new diagnostic method or a new treatment or therapeutic drug, the decision to actually use that diagnostic or use that new therapy in the context of clinical care, that remains within the responsibility of the physician in accordance with what the patient's wishes are. So as such, this relationship between the patient and the physician is much, much closer than the relationship that we see between a researcher and a research subject. The physician-patient relationship is much more iterative. It requires much, much higher levels of communication and trust, and indeed we see this reflected both in our laws and in our different codes of ethics. Furthermore, so when undertaking research to develop a new diagnostic or a new therapy, a researcher is responsible for ensuring some level of safety and efficacy, but generally the researcher is not regarded as being responsible for any changes that that innovation might cause in the therapeutic context. So for example, the researcher is not necessarily responsible for taking into consideration what the new innovation might mean in terms of changes in how a doctor goes about actually diagnosing a patient or choosing a particular course of treatment among several options. All of that remains in the clinical responsibility end. And for the most part, we don't see this as being a problem because as a disciplinary matter, biomedical research and medicine have very similar end goals, the end goal being to improve patient care, both in terms of safety and efficacy, and also in terms of accessibility. Now, some might say that this is not necessarily true, that accessibility is, a primary driver for biomedical researchers. I choose to kind of remain optimistic that people are going into this field because they want to help people, not necessarily because they just want to make a lot of money. So, we have those similarities as well. Biomedical researchers and physicians largely go through very similar schooling and training for the most part, and as such they have largely similar understandings of pathology and treatment. They have a shared basis of understanding of patient care considerations, such as ease of use or ease of compliance with a treatment regimen, what undesirable side effects might be. And furthermore, as we already discussed, the biomedical researchers and the physicians largely share some similar bioethical obligations. Where I think this equilibrium might be disrupted is at this convergence of engineering and biomedical research. It's clearly observable that engineering is increasingly pervading biomedical research, be it in the development of these, weakly convergent engineering solutions like pacemakers, or in these more strongly convergent areas like genetic engineering or synthetic biology. What's more, I think, the farther we are along this continuum of technologies that enable increasing levels of architectural and functional design freedom, the more we see a broader range of engineering disciplines involved in the development of these new technologies, be they approaches or be they final products. And each of these different engineering fields are really very, very different. The schooling is different, the training is different, and most importantly, the extent to which patient care is identified as being a potential end goal is very, very different. So how might this then present problems in this context of biomedical research or clinical care for the patient? So let's start again as an example, let's start with our weakly convergent engineering solution to a biological problem, this pacemaker. So when they're designing this device, we probably have, a material engineer who's involved. We probably have some electrical engineers who are involved. And so if you ask the materials engineer what, his biggest challenge is in designing this product, the answer you might get is something like, overcoming quality problems in the materials that are available to produce the device, that the synthetic materials aren't of a high enough quality, and that provides some design limitations. If you ask the electrical engineer that same question, she might tell you that her biggest challenge is ensuring that there's reliable long-term power for the device. Either way, the engineer's challenges are quite likely to be technological in nature. If you ask the physician what his biggest concerns are with this device, he might tell you it's something like ease of implantability or ease of maintenance for the device. But if you ask the patient, I think the answer you get might be very, very different. And I'm reminded of an episode from one of my favorite television shows, The Golden Girls, where Blanche, who's the character that's most identified for her healthy sexual appetite, swears off men after getting a pacemaker because she has this deep fear that too much excitement is going to cause the device to somehow overload and explode. So she keeps saying, I keep seeing those cartoon characters with the smoke coming out of their ears. And I think, this example highlights sort of two important ethical challenges. The first is the introduction of man-made components into the body can in and of itself be a source of anxiety for many patients. And this is likely, I think, to be especially true as the devices become smaller and less obtrusive. Now, this may seem counterintuitive to say they cause more anxiety as they get smaller and less obtrusive, but as they get smaller and become more permanently integrated into the body, these devices become by and large invisible to the physician. The broken part has been fixed, and the patient is now considered whole again from the physician's perspective, potentially. But the patient herself may not feel whole. She may continue to live with this anxiety that the engineered device is going to malfunction. And in fact, the more sophisticated the device becomes, the more pronounced that anxiety may be. So think about how many times your smartphone has frozen up or the screen has cracked when you've dropped it. Now think about how many times your very first cell phone without any of those smart capabilities froze up or broke. The point not being that, as these devices get more sophisticated, that they are not in fact safer, but that the perception from the perspective of the patient may not necessarily match up to what the safety data supports. And I think the second challenge is that engineering and technology is also enabling greater and greater levels of automation in the diagnosis and treatment and the nature of the physician-patient relationship. And so that's changing the physician-patient relationship. Really, the driving paradigm behind the development of these technological solutions is that these advances in engineering and technology can eventually overcome any biological problem and can do so in ways that are increasingly safer and more precise because we're eliminating that element of human error on the part of the doctor. But for the patient, these same technological solutions can erode the need for ongoing communication and trust and an ongoing relationship with the physician. And this change in the relationship in and of itself may also be the source of some anxiety for the patient. Put otherwise, a physician might put in the pacemaker and rely on the device's own automated safety systems to ensure proper functioning. But, whose responsibility is it to worry about what that change in the relationship means for the patient? Is it the physicians? Is it the engineers? Is it the entire research teams? I don't know. So I think increasingly we're likely to see this shift of responsibilities for the physician along all of these different levels of care as all of them seek to become more automated. As far as I can tell from the information that I've seen, neither of these concerns has really been addressed in any meaningful way, despite the fact that they are of central importance to the physician's ethical duties to their patients. And I think perhaps this is because neither patients nor doctors feel empowered to raise normative objections to technological advances that are resulting in objective improvements in healthcare outcomes. Or it might be because automation has so far been so incremental and that we're going to see more objections in the years to come. Another area of convergence in engineering and life sciences that might give rise to some new legal and ethical challenges for biomedical research and for clinical medicine is the area of human enhancement. So as it stands now, the traditional end goal for both of these disciplines is curative and preventative. So like NIH won't fund research that covers, human enhancement. Human enhancement doesn't fall within the jurisdiction of FDA. But many of the same engineering techniques that are being used for therapeutic purposes could also be used for human enhancement purposes. So, for example, you could do some genetic manipulation to correct a flaw, a gene, for example, that results in low enzymatic function in the liver. You could use the same technique to sort of ramp up enzymatic production in the liver. You could have a super liver, drink everybody under the table. Now, I know it's not scientifically as easy as I just described it, but the point is that the underlying methodology from an engineering standpoint would be roughly the same regardless of what the intended outcome is. And we see this also in the context of prostheses, where you could have limbs that are potentially better. How are we doing on time?
We have until 1:30.
Oh, we have until 1:30.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're doing good. So yeah, we could have, bionic limbs that, eventually or already are better in terms of some function capacities than, natural body parts. We also see some potential for human enhancement in neural engineering, where there are efforts underway to develop ways to, interface the human brain with computers. So what about these types of applications? Part of the problem that we're facing is that our laws and our codes of ethic are virtually silent on this issue of enhancement, despite the fact that we all recognize the potential for broad societal implications. I mean, this concern over superhumans is really a major canon for all of our science fiction and our comic books and things like that. So we know that it is a problem that society is concerned about. So whose responsibility is it to begin addressing these ethical challenges? Does it need to be first addressed by medical ethics, research ethics? Should it be handled by the engineers? At a more basic level, what about the issue of whether we're comfortable as a society with reducing our biological heritage down to a set of standardized parts? Are we comfortable as a society with deviating wholly from these evolutionary principles of descent to begin engineering our own biological systems and even our own organisms through synthetic means? I think it's kind of important to point out that when we first developed the ability to manipulate the genome, to engineer the genome, our biomedical research community largely came together and decided to proceed slowly in order to give society some time to grapple with the emerging ethical issues. And we have not seen really even a hint of this in the context of synthetic biology. Now, different people are going to give you different answers as to why this is the case. Some people might say it's because synthetic biology is just an extension of genetic engineering, so we've already done that, social ethical exploration and come up with our answers. I'd argue that another likely explanation is that genetic engineering was largely driven by researchers with training and expertise in the life sciences, while synthetic biology is largely being driven by engineers from outside the life science disciplines. I'd contend that it's not really within the traditional disciplinary training of these areas of engineering to take a pause for public debate about morality, especially when we're still early in the design phase. There's a final matter. I want to talk briefly about what I think this all means for us as the professionals who are responsible for either providing the patient care or for developing the new technological tools that are used in the patient care, are responsible for marketing those tools. Some of us might be responsible for regulating those tools, and many of us are responsible for educating those people who will then, develop them, regulate them, market them, and use them in patients. What does this all mean for us? I think the first important thing is to recognize that we do have some unaddressed ethical issues that we're either dealing with in the short term right now or that are in the pipeline and we're going to be dealing with eventually, and we've talked about several of those already. I think the second issue is that once we've recognized that there are these unaddressed issues, we need to start thinking about how we want to handle them as a matter of training and as a matter of professional ethics. And I think that this is especially important in some of the engineering fields that traditionally haven't had much application in the biomedical realm. So I know, for example, for those of you who are biomedical engineers, that ABET has specific requirements for accreditation, that biomedical engineering programs have to provide fairly extensive training, both on the medical ethics end and on the engineering ethics end. But those accreditation requirements and those professional ethics considerations that are in your codes of ethics wouldn't necessarily cover students that are coming out of the electrical engineering or the mechanical engineering disciplines who might eventually end up on these research teams developing products for application in patient care. In those areas of engineering, I don't mean to suggest that they don't have any ethics trainings or they don't have codes of ethics, but their ethical codes are largely assuming that the engineers are going to be working with materials that lack chemical or biological activity, that it assumes they're working with materials that are inert, and they're also not assuming necessarily that we're going to have a patient care context. As a third matter, I think that there is a need for more research into how to most effectively ingrain a regard for ethical considerations into our engineers, especially those that are not receiving ethics training on biomedical issues. So the current approach that's taken by ABET for the biomedical engineers is to have ethics courses taught by engineering faculty rather than by faculty from, say, a philosophy department or an ethics department. The idea being that this imparts to the students that ethics is a central part of the engineering discipline, that it's not something peripheral. And I personally tend to agree with this approach, but I think that it's also important now that we're starting to have some history with these types of trainings and we have some measurable outcomes to look at. I think it's increasingly important to start looking at the growing literature that talks about how attempts at teaching ethics are less successful the farther along a person is in their training or in their level of expertise. So increasingly studies are demonstrating that engineering students, if you teach them about ethics while they're undergraduates, that it's a very natural tendency for them to reflect on these issues and to that later on down in their careers, they build these ethical considerations into their practice as a matter of course. While once you introduce those ethics trainings at the PhD level or at the postgraduate level, they have much, much less of an effect because the individual already feels that they are experts and they're sort of ingrained in their ways. And then finally, I think it's important for engineers to begin thinking about whether some of these ethical challenges should be addressed not just as reflexive matters or issues to be aware of because they might eventually, affect a doctor or a patient, but to start thinking rather about whether these ethical considerations are critical issues that need to be addressed and that need to inform the actual design process. So, for example, if we're concerned that an implanted diagnostic device is going to reduce the amount of communication that doctors and patients have with one another, perhaps this should be a consideration as a matter of design for the engineers to build the system, to build the device in such a way that, for example, it provides notification every 6 months that it's, both to the doctor and to the physician that it's time for an appointment and a face-to-face consultation. So I think I'll stop there so that we have time for some questions and discussion. Thoughts from the audience? Yes?
Well, I would have a whole series of questions, but I'm wondering about the bottom axis of one of your graphs.
Okay?
of value to research and society, and I'm wondering about that research combined with society.
Well, I mean, I think what we're seeing as these parts become more standardized, or as we're better able to understand these smaller components, is that they have more information that is valuable to people with a range of conditions or problems rather than people with a particular problem. So for example, you might be able to do a study looking at different people's hearts to see where there's a defect in that heart. But you're sort of limited in terms of what you're looking at. The amount of information that you can pull from a biospecimen or from someone's genomic data is considerably more. It can be used over and over again in research for a number of different research end goals, and as such, it can produce
No, my question
valuable.
is about collapsing the categories of research in society. That
So
value to research would be equivalent to value to society.
Yeah, I think to a great extent, as long as we're assuming that research and society have the same goals, which I mean to a certain extent, some of the goals that the research community has may be different than what the goals of society are. But insofar as what we mean is benefits, knowledge benefits, I think that they can be
Because
collapsed.
I think there's a point of convergence there with the engineering codes, for example, on value to society. One of the lead principles in the Mechanical Engineering, American Society of Mechanical Engineers Code of Ethics is public service. It's the same for the civil engineers. So I think there might be some convergence there in a way to bring the two ethical traditions together.
Yeah, I think you definitely have a point. And I don't by any means mean to imply that, there is no shared basis of ethical concern across the different engineering disciplines. I mean, there are engineering ethics, exactly as you're saying, with goals to drive public interest missions. There are, some shared there's some similarities in terms of, where you're minimizing risk, making sure that, you're not creating something that's so expensive that nobody would ever have access to it. All of these are ethical considerations that are taken into account in all disciplines of engineering. But, there are also some departures that result specifically from, the context in which the technology will eventually be applied. I think that context where it's applied, especially inside a human body, is very, very different. I mean, the number of variables and uncertainties that you can introduce are much, much larger, and the threshold for where we think risk is justified or acceptable is also very, very different. Other?
So I haven't thought this through enough yet. It might come across as stupid, but why do you think that minimizing patient-physician interaction may be a negative? I always think, so I'm a transplant physician, and I always feel like when we get to a point that our patients are seeing us less, they're actually going towards better health and to better sense of normalcy in their lives. So why is that considered to be a bad thing?
I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I'm not saying that that outcome is necessarily bad, but I'm not sure that we have. I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm not a medical professional, so maybe I'm wrong about this. But is that a matter of consensus that?
Well, so I use a fair amount of technology in my world, and we are very nervous when we use it. And the newer it is, the more nervous we are. And so I see my patients constantly. So it's our norm to see patients twice a week as outpatients initially after transplant. And when we get to a point that we're seeing them once a week, once a month, the further we get out from seeing each other, and we're still calling them all the time to make sure they're okay, the further we get away from this constant connection, I feel like they go back to being what the intention of this whole intervention was to having a normal life.
I think that's definitely true. I mean, if I had to have a pacemaker, and my hope would be to have the one that fixes me as much as possible, that I don't need to make recurring visits to my doctor. I don't think it's so much necessarily about the frequency of the visits. I think it has to do with what the effect is on that trust relationship between a patient and a physician. I mean, when you go to a physician, it's because, you want a human that is trained in this particular art to, provide your diagnosis and to provide your treatment and to provide your ongoing monitoring. Now, you have that pacemaker, and it's, returns you to a point of, more normal function, but as the patient, is your thought now that, I no longer have this trust relationship with my physician, I have an owner's manual and an 800 number to call if the device malfunctions and an engineer is going to talk to me, or is it going to be someone, as I think that patient-doctor relationship, both in terms of what it means in legal obligations and ethical obligations, assumes that a lot of it is premised that the physician is doing the diagnosing, that the physician is doing the treating. What we're really seeing with some of these new technologies is that, that point of diagnosis and that point of treatment has already happened in the research lab. It's manufactured into the product. It's a device that's doing the diagnosing. It's a device that's doing the treating. That's not necessarily bad, but it does call for some consideration of then how we handle the subsequent legal issues. When the thing breaks, if you got bad treatment before and the thing broke, you'd sue your doctor. Now, what does it mean when are you suing the engineer that developed the device? What are the duties that they owe to you in terms of, how this device functioned? And also, as, I was describing, I think largely the decisions for what therapeutic to use, what diagnostic to use, and how to interpret those results so far has fallen on the physician. If we automate that and it's automated in the research lab and the product comes, delivered, then perhaps those sets of considerations need to be taken on by the design team, because they're no longer being made after the product has already been designed. Am I making sense?
So can I add on to that?
Sure.
So this is sort of pushing the question a little bit further, but as you're talking, it strikes me that, perhaps part of the concern is that to the extent to which you have a physician focusing on and getting information from the device, it may dilute or certainly would change the degree to which the physician is focusing on the relationship with the patient per se. You sort of talk about that kind of whole person interaction. That may then affect sort of the development of trust or the maintenance of trust in that relationship. To whatever extent we think that trust is about relationships, if the gaze turns to the device as opposed to the full person, it may affect things.
Exactly. Now the individual, the patient, has to trust in the device, which is very different from trusting the therapeutic relationship. It's very different in terms of what duties emerge, where you can assign blame and responsibility. And, the other thing is, while we do want patients to be visiting less and less often, if there's a problem that we fix as a diagnostic matter, having regular contact with a physician is still important. If we get to the point that we think that everything is just solved through the technology, then, the physician is asking you questions beyond just whatever it is that they're treating you for in that isolated instance. There might be some value to that interaction. So.
In a very simplistic way, could you say that your work is really a project about examining the distribution or the redistribution of responsibility around these issues?
I think that's exactly what it is. It's about the redistribution, not only across the different disciplines and the different, contexts of research development, manufacturing, patient care, but it also, has to do with, we provide ethics at different levels. We have the professional ethics, we have, our social ethics, we have, the ethics that govern what happens in a laboratory, and then we have the more philosophical ethical issues that we examine as scholars and address in the classroom. And there is perhaps a need to see whether there needs to be some of that additional, work on either the, scholarly end to evaluate, whether we have societal consensus on where we want to end up on some of these ethical issues to inform then the decisions we make on the professional ethics end about how to distribute these responsibilities. So part of it is that, yes, people's responsibilities are different. The other is that there might be responsibilities that we haven't even identified yet, that need to be identified.
What are the current requirements for ethics training for undergraduates in engineering, and is it addressed on the EIT, the current version of the EIT exam that they take when they graduate, they get their bachelor's degree?
I think there are probably some individuals in the room that might be more familiar with what those requirements are.
The requirements have changed, in the process of changing even further. The National Science Foundation was mandated, I think, in 2009 through the America Competes Act to become involved in research training for undergraduate students as well as graduate students. Any student who works under any research sponsored by the National Science Foundation must be trained in research ethics. Now, there's a divergence, and I'm looking at that and the comment that my colleague who was sitting here a moment ago made. That says value to research and society.
Yeah.
I would break that. Research means not just research, but means research conducted and sponsored by large corporations, governmental entities. So then it means profit. And one has to enhance them in training of engineers who've been kept away from, not ethical training, because there is, everything done in engineering is to develop products for society. So they are closer to society than most researchers. But the gap then becomes between training for engineers who are doing things for society and assuring that there is a level of individual responsibility in the research that these engineers conduct and the products that they develop.
The reason I asked the question, I got a Bachelor of Science degree a long time ago in chemical engineering, and then was required at graduation to take the EIT exam. Engineering, it still exists, right? EIT, everyone has to take it? Okay. Was required to take the exam in order, and took a job in industry. There was no training in ethics required. It's not required anywhere in the U.S. for engineering students, and there was nothing about ethics on the exam. And when I went to work in industry, there was, ethics was what the company you worked for defined it to be, and in fact, if your ethical traits were what profited the company, they weren't necessarily of the value of society to society.
That's exactly what I'm saying. And
Right.
that aspect has to be addressed.
So is there, at the University of Minnesota now, in order to get an engineering degree, is there any requirement for ethics?
The requirement is that you must be exposed to ethics training, principally responsible conduct of research. That's the requirement.
So for example, I
got
do,
my degree in biomedical engineering a few years ago. So ABET defines and standards that you need to have in order to graduate with a degree in biomedical engineering. One of those is an ethics exposure, as you said. So generally that means like it's a very short course, a few lectures, generally given by your own professors. And so it gives you some context, but then put in the context of the degree itself. I'm taking, like when we had it, I was taking biotransport, biomechanics, it kind of falls off. This is the easy, I can just read it and forget it class because I got these other things. So yes, we're exposed to it, but.
And that's for the biomedical engineers specifically because they, the work has that medical context. So I do the ethics trainings for the people that use the nanofabrication facility that we have on campus, and I get, people from a range of disciplines that are using that facility since, nano is across all different sectors. And with the exception of people that have done biomedical engineering, even the people who already have PhDs, most of them have not received ethics training beyond the ethics training that deals with things like, making sure your stuff is valid and that you are not plagiarizing and you're providing professional accreditation. There's no training about the broader implications of the research and the technology. And so these individuals, they get their ethics training because, again, NSF, or there's a requirement in the National Nanotechnology Initiative that there be some ethics training for facilities that have, funding pursuant to that act. What they get is half an hour with me.
That's it?
Half an hour.
And so are you proposing a university-wide standard or a national standard?
I've seen literature from some people who are proposing a need to have these kinds of, deeper ethics training modules at the undergraduate level, that take that look like something like a semester-long course or a year-long course so that, these don't seem like peripheral issues. And there's also a lot of work being done now to see about actually embedding ethicists in engineering departments, both for the purposes of carrying out research and for training purposes. But that has received mixed receptions.
There's an underlying assumption in this work, it seems to me, of a progressive nature, that this is really a good thing. It is good for society, that we have this knowledge. But I think that can be questioned. And I'm wondering about not just ethicists talking to engineers and researchers, but social studies of science and technology, which is where the critique actually comes from. The critique really doesn't come from ethics, I don't believe, for the most part.
I think you're right.
It comes from the social science studies of technology that are critiquing technology. And what is your view on that? And are there any programs that try to incorporate that perspective?
So the work is happening in all of these different areas, but the problem is that as of yet, I have yet to really see, the different groups come together to address how these issues arise in their particular context. Yeah, the STS scholars are doing the, critical work. I see, people in evaluating what it means in the patient care context, people evaluating what it means, from an industrial standpoint, what it means in terms of law, what it means, in terms of patient care. But there's really no project right now to bring these groups together to, develop an actual set of recommendations or, a curriculum or a course forward, yeah. There have been some, individual studies done where they've taken a group of undergraduate students and exposed them to, a different type of ethics training, and so they evaluate them at the beginning on, what's their ability to gauge ethical and social issues, and then they evaluate them again at the end to see, how the outcomes are. And they've done this, with a variety of different approaches to actually teaching the ethics. The interesting thing is that, from what I've seen, kind of regardless of how it is that they approach the ethical issues and they approach the teaching, it does have an impact all of the approaches have an impact in terms of, when they're done with the training, and even then when they look, 10, 15 years down at the individual once they're working as a professional, how much they say that they take the ethical issues into consideration in the course of their work. I mean, and I see this myself, this is just anecdotal. So when I do ethics trainings with undergraduates, and then I do it with graduate students, or I do it with professionals, it's almost way easier to do it with the undergrads. It's as though these ethical principles they're there. It's natural to think about these broader implications of what the work might mean, what the individual's role is with respect to the whole system and all of society. At the point that they've become real topic experts, at times the audience becomes almost a little bit hostile to the idea that somebody who's not, especially, somebody like me who doesn't have that, science background, is coming in and now talking about, what are the other things you need to take into account when doing your work? They say, we handle the stewardship ourselves. So, sort of the important takeaway is that the education helps, sort of regardless of how it's delivered.
That's really interesting, I think, and I'd like to hear from some of the engineers. I think from practice disciplines like healthcare, my own feeling is it's often easier to teach those that have had experience and who have been out a while than to teach, let's say, freshman medical students or nursing students, because they don't have any experience. So if engineers are in fact different, if they benefit earlier on in a way, that must have something to do with the nature of engineering work and the fact that they're working on material objects in a way that is different than working as a physician or a nurse on a human body.
I think it is. The people who go into healthcare recognize that at some point the work that they're doing involves coming into contact with individuals and, dealing with them on a human level. A person that goes to school to be an electrical engineer may end up working on a pacemaker, but, they didn't go to electrical engineering school thinking, I'm really going to have to interact with people on a human level about this technology that I'm developing. And honestly, the reception that I often get from, engineers when I'm doing the ethics trainings is they say, well, my work is just in the laboratory, or I'm just designing a component that, somebody else in my research team is going to use to develop a device with a particular application. My area of work doesn't produce a particular application. This is especially true, the more they work on the basic end of research rather than on the applied end of research. So they really see themselves as, there's a bar and they're insulated from the human that it eventually involves. Now, the thing is that before these kinds of engineers were working with these inert materials and circuitry and things like that. Now, the kinds of things that they're working are biological components. They've been reduced down to, the level and the same level of standardization and the same function as a switch. So when they create, for example, I was talking about creating a bacteria that's able to turn gene expression on and off. The architecture for that is basically the same as any circuit. An electrical engineer can develop this. There are handbooks, so anyone can sort of develop these. It's really like a Lego type system. It's plug and play. You just build it. So, it's taking, I think, a bit of time for the fact that this has direct human implications to enter the discipline, that the work isn't just about the circuit anymore. It's about what it means in the genetic context, for example, if you go into that line of work.
So how would an ethically trained engineer handle that differently, as opposed to just advancing knowledge as it is? Like, you're just trying to make things better. So instead, you're ethically trained, what would you do differently?
I think an engineer that's trained in these kinds of ethical considerations would different things that they take into account as a member of a design team designing a product that would have a human health application. For example, I mean, when they're helping in the conceptualization of what the design process is, it might change some of the design decisions that they choose to make if they know that, you know, this is going to end up in a person and might have these additional implications. I mean, you know, at another level, it might also just have a difference in terms of what kinds of career paths people trained in those particular disciplines choose to take. There is actually a pretty significant shortage in electrical engineers and especially in electrical engineers, but to a certain extent also, you know, mechanical engineers that work in, you know, stuff that then goes into robotics or creating prostheses and things like that. And I think it's largely because we've isolated these fields and not necessarily, you know, ever demonstrated or highlighted the importance that they play in this biomedical context.
Can I elaborate on that a little bit? So just as an example, say a pacemaker. If you're thinking purely engineering, you want to know what's the voltage drop you need, how long does the battery have to last, what materials you're going to use, how is the material handled in the body, such as corrosion especially, what's the failure rate? Because are you going to expect 1 in 10,000 of these to failure or 1 in a million? Preferably 1 in a million, but you're always going to have failure. If you're ethically trained, you might think more broadly, not only those things, but if, you know, who's the person this is going into, as she was saying, and, you know, what are other circumstances that person is. Is this person also, besides just congestive heart failure, also having issues breathing? Can they move? Who takes care of them at home? Do they have nursing? Do they have an income? So you expand basically your design criteria.
Definitely this issue of price makes a difference, right? How accessible it's going to be in terms of, you know, your price, but it also might be, you know, how does it look cosmetically? What is the ease of use for the patient? What maintenance requirements does it have? All these different things that are important from the perspective of the patient. Yeah.